In an exclusive district of the city, surrounded by centuries-old trees and high stone walls, stood an imposing manor, a silent witness to the bygone glory of Mr. Fernando's family. The once splendid facade of the house now bore the marks of time. The faded green shutters and the climbing ivy clinging to the stone walls seemed to reflect the soul of the man who lived there. A man once vibrant and full of life, now a prisoner of growing solitude. Mr. Fernando, now 75 years old, had seen prosperous days in this historic place. He had successfully managed several family businesses, amassing considerable wealth, but all of that now felt distant, almost unreal. The house, which once echoed with the laughter and animated conversations of his 5 children and his wife, was now eerily silent. The long hallway lined with family portraits leading to the grand staircase was a relic of happier times. Days when family dinners were lively, joyful voices rang out from the living room, and his wife Maria filled the house with love and warmth. Since Maria's passing more than a decade earlier, the manor had slowly emptied of life. His children, now grown and successful, had each taken their own path. They all lived far away, absorbed in their international careers and their own families. Although Fernando occasionally received calls or cards, visits had become increasingly rare. The busyness of his children's lives and their responsibilities had rendered him a stranger in their daily routines. Fernando, though he never openly admitted it, suffered from immense loneliness, a void that neither wealth nor prestige could fill. In this vast manor, only Carla, his devoted housekeeper, and Isabel, his talented cook, still kept him company. Yet even their daily attentive presence couldn't fill the absence that weighed on him. Carla, with her unwavering dedication, had been by his side for over 30 years. Petite but full of energy, she had watched the children grow, Maria depart, and she understood better than anyone Fernando's silent sadness. She ensured that every corner of the manor was immaculate, every detail attended to, as if maintaining order and cleanliness could ease the pain of the past. Carla was discreet, but her actions were filled with compassion and devotion. Isabel, on the other hand, had taken over the kitchen after Maria's death. Younger than Carla, she was equally attentive to Fernando's needs. She knew his favorite dishes, exactly how he liked his coffee in the morning, and took pleasure in recreating the recipes Maria had once prepared for him. Her expert hands could transform the simplest ingredients into feasts, but more than the food, it was her warm smile and attention to detail that brought Fernando comfort. Despite all this, despite Carla and Isabel's care, the opulence of his home, and the wealth surrounding him, Fernando felt the crushing weight of isolation every day. His evenings often unfolded in the grand living room, where he sat alone in his favorite armchair, a glass of wine in hand, his gaze lost in the dancing flames of the fireplace. The room, tastefully decorated, exuded the luxury of days gone by, but everything seemed frozen in the past. The antique furniture, velvet curtains, and Persian rugs, none of it had changed for decades. Everything in the house bore the mark of a bygone era, and every corner reminded Fernando of what he had lost. In the evenings, after Isabel had left, he would slowly climb the dark wooden staircase, his steps echoing in the oppressive silence of the house. He would pass by the photos hanging on the walls, the smiling portraits of his children, the images of Maria, beautiful and graceful, who seemed to gaze at him softly. In his bedroom, one of the few rooms still inhabited in the house, he would retreat under heavy blankets, but even the comfort of his bed couldn't dispel the coldness that settled in his heart each night. Yet, despite this melancholy that weighed on him, Fernando was not a broken man. He continued to oversee his businesses, albeit more distantly, and his children always showed him respect. But a part of him knew that something essential eluded him: human connection, love, the closeness he had once known. And as the days stretched on, identical and monotonous, Fernando sometimes wondered what his future would hold. A significant portion of his fortune was hidden, scattered across various properties, artworks, and investments. Though he had 5 children, he had never spoken to anyone about his true intentions regarding his inheritance. It was a secret he kept to himself, a decision he had yet to make. It was in this context that Sophie entered the scene, a 19-year-old young woman full of energy and ambition but whose life had been marked by hardship. Sophie came from modest means, where every day was a struggle for survival. She had grown up in a cramped apartment with her mother, a woman worn down by years of precarious work and unstable relationships. The absence of a father, who had left before she was even born, left a void in her life, a quest for love and security she had never been able to fulfill. Her childhood was punctuated by constant moves, months spent unsure if they could afford rent, and the uncertainty of what tomorrow would bring. As an adult, Sophie quickly understood that the world would offer her no more than what she could seize for herself. But her efforts to escape poverty always seemed in vain. She had tried to pursue an education, working part-time in dead-end jobs, but nothing guaranteed the security she dreamed of. The promise of a better life remained elusive. So when Sophie met Fernando, a man who embodied everything she had never had, wealth, comfort and power, she was irresistibly drawn to the idea of an easy and stable life. Their relationship, surprising at first glance, had developed almost naturally. Fernando, with his kind but weary gaze, saw in Sophie an escape from his loneliness and the monotony of his days. She was a breath of fresh air, a spark of youth in his aging life. In return, he promised her the world. He spoke of inheritance, of a golden future where she would never have to worry about anything again. "Stay with me until the end of my days, and everything I have will be yours," he told her in a deep voice, tinged with the wisdom he seemed to have gained over the years. Fascinated by the promise of a radiant future, Sophie accepted the implicit agreement. After all, Fernando asked for nothing more than her companionship. He didn't demand passion or deep emotional commitment, just her presence, a shoulder to lean on. It was a deal that, at first, seemed easy to honor. All she had to do was wait, stay by his side, and play the role of the attentive young woman. In exchange, she would finally have the security she had always dreamed of. The inheritance, this bright and reassuring promise, attracted her like a light in the darkness of her unfulfilled hopes. But soon, what had started as an opportunity turned into an emotional trap. The idea of financial stability became tinged with a much darker reality. Sophie, who had thought she could simply enjoy the situation, realized that Fernando's constant presence, his silent expectations, and the way he looked at her were more oppressive than she had imagined. She couldn't help but feel an increasing anxiety as she wandered through Fernando's imposing manor. The vast, cold and silent rooms, the antique furniture that bore witness to a bygone era, and the family portraits on the walls made her uneasy. She didn't belong in this world. Every object seemed steeped in history and wealth alien to her, making her feel more and more like a stranger in this house, which, despite its luxury, resembled a museum more than a home. Fernando often spoke to her about the future, insisting on the day she would inherit everything. But for Sophie, his words left a bitter taste. They felt like invisible chains binding her to him. She realized that every day spent with him deepened her sense of entrapment. She saw in his eyes, once filled with tenderness, a possessiveness she hadn't anticipated. She felt trapped in an unspoken contract, an exchange of promises that weighed heavier on her with each passing day. The hardest part for her was masking her doubts. Fernando, though aging, was still perceptive to her reactions. He noticed subtle changes in her behavior, and whenever she tried to distance herself, he pulled her back with new promises, lavish gifts, or simply comforting words. "You have nothing to fear, my dear. All of this will be yours one day. You only need to be patient." But patience was becoming a burden. Sophie began to understand that the promise of inheritance was a double-edged sword. The longer she stayed, the more impossible it seemed to betray him by leaving. The inheritance had come to symbolize more than just material security. It was the symbol of her prison. She had to stay by his side, watch him grow older, and comfort him in his final days. But how long would that take? Months? Years? And what would become of her if, in the end, she decided to leave? Sophie now lived with constant anxiety. Every step she took in the manor echoed her own doubts. The walls seemed to close in around her, and the cold beauty of the home only amplified her sense of claustrophobia. With each passing day, she felt like she was losing a part of herself. The promise of inheritance, once a comforting dream, had become a sword of Damocles hanging over her head. She knew she had to make a choice. But whatever she chose, It would come at a price. One night, as Sophie tossed and turned in her bed, unable to sleep, a restless energy grew within her. She had spent days ruminating on her thoughts, weighing her options, and the anxiety of her situation was becoming unbearable. Finally, driven by an insatiable curiosity, she decided to leave her room and venture into the dark corridors of the manor. Never before had she dared to explore the house alone at such a late hour, but something, a deep instinct, told her she had to. The walls of the house, covered in wallpaper worn by time, seemed to whisper forgotten secrets. With each step she took, the floorboards creaked beneath her feet, a sound that resonated in the heavy silence of the night. Darkness enveloped her, but her heart raced, a melody of nervousness and excitement. Deep down, she hoped to find answers, a glimpse into the hidden truths that had long eluded her. Sophie slowly made her way to the forbidden door, the one Fernando always kept locked, where he disappeared for hours. This mystery had haunted her. What could possibly be hidden behind that door? Her thoughts swirled with anticipation. To her great surprise, the door was ajar. A shiver ran through her, but she couldn't turn back now. She gently pushed the door open and stepped inside. What she discovered left her speechless. The room was bathed in dim light, filled with documents, old letters, and photographs she had never seen before. Every corner was adorned with objects of great value. Gleaming gold bars, sparkling jewels, and works of art hidden beneath dusty velvet cloths. It was a hidden treasure trove, a wealth Fernando had carefully preserved over the years. Yet amidst this display of riches, a worn leather journal caught her attention. Sophie approached it, a strange attraction compelling her to touch it. The scent of leather and yellowed paper overwhelmed her. She opened it carefully, her heart racing, and began reading passages that spoke of Fernando and a woman she didn't know. But it wasn't his wife. The ink spread across the pages, revealing a story of unexpected depth and complexity. A betrayal. A forbidden love. A cursed inheritance. The words immersed her in a captivating tale, where Fernando confessed his feelings for a woman who wasn't the one he had married. The writing, both sweet and bitter, painted a fleeting love, hidden in the shadows of social conventions and family expectations. Sophie could almost feel the pain and desire that radiated from every line. The details were troubling. Fernando spoke of secret meetings, promises whispered under the moonlight, and a burning passion that had slipped beyond control. But the narrative didn't stop there. He also spoke of the betrayal of a friend, of a plot devised to separate the couple of lovers, and the devastating consequences that had followed. What could have been a shared happiness had turned into an inevitable tragedy. Sophie realized that she stood at the heart of a family drama far larger than she had ever imagined, a drama that still weighed heavily on Fernando. With every word she read, a question flared up in her mind. How many hearts had he broken to keep this secret? How many women had been seduced by his promises of wealth and security, just like her? A part of her was awakening to the reality of the situation. She might not be the first, and he was probably not the last, to fall under the spell of a man who knew how to manipulate hearts as skillfully as he managed the strings of his inheritance. Sophie closed the journal with a muffled thud, her mind in turmoil. This manor was not just a refuge for Fernando. It was a place full of dark secrets and unresolved stories. A quiet fear crept into her, mingling with an irresistible curiosity. She understood now that there was a price to pay for everything Fernando offered, a price she hadn't considered at first. His promises of inheritance now took on a very different hue. A sense of conflict overwhelmed her. She wondered whether she should stay and accept this inheritance, with all its implications and mysteries, or flee before it was too late. Fernando's promises, though tempting, were becoming a source of anxiety. Was she ready to dive into this cursed inheritance, to face the reality of this man with buried secrets? Memories of her own childhood, marked by deprivation, returned to her. Had this quest for stability that had led her into Fernando's arms turned into a trap? She rose abruptly, thoughts in disarray, and began pacing the room. The walls, heavy with untold stories, seemed to whisper warnings. The anxiety paralyzed her, but she knew she couldn't stay forever. Finally, she made her way to the door, hesitant. She knew she had to make a decision, and that each choice she made could mark her forever. Whatever she chose, she would never be able to turn back. This manor, this man, this inheritance. It had all become a labyrinth, and she didn't know if she would come out of it unscathed. Before leaving the room, she cast one last glance at the journal, realizing that it contained much more than words. It was the reflection of a life, a hidden past, and choices Fernando had made to protect his inheritance. As she crossed the threshold, she turned one final time toward the heart of the manor. She knew she would have to face the reality of her choices, that the promises of the man she thought she knew were merely the surface of a much more complex story. Sophie closed the door behind her, her heart pounding. The reality of what she had discovered weighed heavily on her, but a new clarity began to emerge amid the confusion. The material wealth Fernando had promised her, though alluring, could no longer blind her. The secrets and lies surrounding this inheritance had become a chain, and she couldn't afford to be bound by it. In the days that followed, Sophie took time to reflect on her situation. She began exploring the manor's gardens, spending hours wandering among the flowers and trees, trying to make sense of her future. Each step took her farther from Fernando's promises and closer to the freedom she had always desired. One evening, as she stood in the garden, the setting sun casting light on the manor, a decision took shape with unsettling clarity. She had to confront Fernando. The conversation would be difficult, but she knew she could no longer live in uncertainty, torn between the love she felt for this man and the manipulations that surrounded her. The next morning, Sophie found Fernando in his study, engrossed in documents, as usual. At the sight of her he smiled, but his piercing gaze couldn't hide the growing concern in his eyes. She approached him, her heart heavy but resolute, and took a deep breath. "Fernando, I need to talk to you," she said, her voice trembling but firm. He looked up, surprised. "Of course, my dear. What's going on?" She hesitated for a moment but forced herself to continue. "I've discovered things in the study that you thought were hidden. I know about the journal, the inheritance, and the women who came before me." A heavy silence settled in the room, and Fernando, jaw clenched, said nothing. He knew the moment had come. "I can't stay here, Fernando," she continued, tears in her eyes. "I don't want an inheritance that's woven with secrets and lies. I can't build my life on the ruins of others." She could see the disappointment in his eyes, but he straightened up, his gaze expressing a kind of respect. "I understand, Sophie. But there are so many things I never had the chance to tell you. I wanted to protect you from this past." "Protect or manipulate?" she retorted, emotion piercing her voice. "I want to build my own life, not be a puppet in your story." Fernando lowered his eyes, his expression betraying a mix of regret and understanding. "You are much more than just a promise of inheritance. I consider you like family. But I also understand that your freedom is essential." Sophie felt her heart tighten. The man who had captivated her attention and stirred conflicting feelings was also the one who had been trapped by his own decisions. But that didn't change her resolve. "I want to leave the manor," she announced, her voice firmer. "I want to live my life, take risks, and make choices for myself. I want a future that I will shape with my own hands." Fernando nodded, a hint of sadness in his eyes. "I will respect your decision, Sophie. I never wanted you to feel imprisoned here. If this is what you want, then I will free you from all my promises." Sophie smiled at him, tears welling up in her eyes. "Thank you, Fernando. I hope you'll find peace someday." They embraced, a gesture that mixed affection and goodbye. Sophie left the study, her heart both light and heavy. The decision was made, and with each step she took through the manor, she felt the weight of the secrets drift away. She spent her last days in the house preparing, gathering her things and saying goodbye to Carla and Isabel, who had meant so much to her. On the night of her departure, she paused for a moment in the garden, gazing at the manor lit by the moon. This place had been a refuge, but it was time for her to find her own path. At dawn, she left the manor, a new chapter unfolding before her. She had no money, no security, but she had renewed determination and the promise of a future she would build herself. Sophie knew she would face challenges, but deep down, she felt a profound sense of liberation, a breath of fresh air after years of suffocating. She walked away, her heart pounding, but this time, it was the sound of her own freedom that echoed in her mind.